Some of you may well know Captain Pellew from the Hornblower novels by C.S. Forester, or played so memorably by Robert Lindsay in the successful television series inspired by the books. Forester had good reason to place his young Hornblower in the charge of Captain Pellew of the HMS Indefatigable. Edward Pellew was what only can be described as a true British hero. He was the sea captain of all sea captains. In 1770, aged 14, he ran away from school and joined the Navy as a midshipman. So far so good, except his first voyage was not a promising one. He managed to fall out with his captain to such an extent he was put ashore at Marseille, where he hitched a ride back to Britain on a merchant vessel. But soon things changed. Soon enough he was serving with HMS Blonde in the American Revolutionary War. In 1776, at the Battle of Valcour Island, Pellew, all of 19 years of age, with his lieutenant and his fellow midshipmen severely wounded, found himself in command of a smaller vessel called the Carleton in a very sticky situation. Pellew succeeded in getting them out of trouble and demonstrated personal bravery in doing so. He was promised promotion no sooner than he would get back to England. He was 19, and effectively a naval officer. But before he got back to Britain, he was detached from his ship to serve on land and actually took part in the Battle of Saratoga. Thus it was January 1778 that he was back in Britain and made lieutenant, late in his 20th year. He served here and there in British waters, again with distinction. In one action he continued to press, even dismasted a French privateer ship when his captain had been wounded and command fell to him. Clearly he was an officer of considerable promise. He soon enough had his own command. But the Royal Navy expanded and shrank as the need arose, and so he was laid off for a year or two. But by 1782 he was back and in charge of the small HMS Pelican. Within a month or two he had engaged 3 French privateers and harassed them so thoroughly he drove them on shore. By the end of May that year he was promoted to post rank, which meant he was now a captain. He was 25 years old. Only 10 days after that he was put in temporary charge of a 5th-rate ship of the line, the 40-gun HMS Artois. By the 1st of July he had captured a French privateer frigate. This rise was meteoric. But even for a prodigy like Pellew, command of a 40-gun ship at the age of 25 clearly was only a temporary appointment. That said, Pellew was given command of a 32-gun frigate. But peacetime was the enemy of all aspiring naval heroes, and by 1791 he was laid off once more and put back on half pay. Such must his reputation already have been, the Russian Navy offered him a job, but he declined. He would not have to wait long. On the 1st of February 1793, the revolutionary government of France declared war on Great Britain. Once more Pellew found himself given command of a frigate, this time the 36-gun HMS Nymphe. On the 18th of June he engaged the French 36-gun frigate Cleopatra in the English Channel, dismasted her, boarded her, and captured her in such a swift action, the French captain dying in the onslaught, Pellew managed to secure an even greater prize than the ship itself, the French codebook of secret signals, which at once he dispatched to the Admiralty. 11 days later he was presented to the king and knighted. His next command was another frigate, the HMS Arethusa. In 1794 the Arethusa was part of a squadron of frigates, which in turn engaged a squadron of French frigates and corvettes. It comes as no surprise that HMS Arethusa played a leading role in the fighting, and in capturing the Pomone, the largest frigate in service at the time. Aside from capturing the Pomone, the squadron captured another frigate, sank a third, and drove ashore 2 corvettes. An enemy ship driven ashore is a tempting target for a victorious enemy to set ablaze, but Pellew refused to do this, citing that the 2 ships contained wounded men. Later that year he was Commodore of the Western Frigate Squadron, and in 1795 he took command of the ship which is part and parcel of the Pellew legend, HMS Indefatigable. Indefatigable was a ship with a difference, a rasée frigate. She had originally been constructed as a 64-gun 3rd-rate ship of the line and was launched in 1784, but she was a bit of a red herring for her day. Ship design had moved on. 3rd-rate ships of the line were now produced as 74-gun ships. She was too small for her intended role and outgunned. Nonetheless, she provided 10 years solid service, at which point the Navy decided to take radical measures. She was raséed. This was simply the process of removing her upper decks and guns. This turned her from a ship of the line into a large frigate with 44 guns. But more so, she kept the masts and area of sail of a 64-gun ship, but no longer carried much of the weight. Moreover, her structure was that of a bigger, more powerful ship. She carried the heavier guns of the lower decks of a 64 and had the much more powerful build of a third-rate ship of the line. As fast as a frigate, but with heavy guns and thicker, more resilient bulwarks, this was a deadly weapon. She was converted in 1794, and her first captain would become the renowned Commodore Sir Edward Pellew. Commodore he might have been, but Pellew kept the common touch. He raced his own midshipmen to the top of the mainmast. Try as they might, they could not beat him. He was the complete seaman. There was not a task aboard his ship he himself could not perform. It goes without saying, he was deeply respected by his men. His physical bravery, it seems, knew no end. In January 1796, the East Indiaman Dutton ran aground near Plymouth in heavy seas. Women and children were aboard, alongside the crew and 400 soldiers. The sea would surely dash the ship apart and take them all. Pellew himself swam from the shore to the stricken vessel, helping another naval hero of the day, Jeremiah Coughlin, who managed to attach a rope to the ship to act as a lifeline. Jeremiah Coughlin had gone to sea as a cabin boy. Here he was, an ordinary sailor, risking his life alongside the great Sir Edward Pellew. A great many lives were saved that day. Coughlin himself managed to carry 50 away in a boat. 2 months later, Pellew would be made a baronet for his daring effort. But Coughlin also should not come off empty-handed. He had found a patron. Pellew persuaded him to join Indefatigable as a midshipman. Coughlin distinguished himself yet further in this service, and Pellew rewarded him by effecting his promotion to lieutenant and being granted command of the cutter HMS Viper, which served in Pellew's squadron. He was to reach the rank of captain by 34. Jeremiah Coughlin would be known among the men as Intrepid Jerry. Such was the touch of Pellew. He would seek to promote an ordinary sailor all the way. If in March Pellew was made a baronet, by April he was off the coast of Ireland with his squadron, capturing the French frigate Unité, and only 9 days later the frigate Virginie. Then in January 1797, his Indefatigable, accompanied only by the frigate HMS Amazon, came across the French 74-gun ship of the line, Droit de l'Homme. It was to be Pellew's most famous naval engagement. 2 frigates should never be able to match a ship of that size, but there was a storm going, and in the heavy seas the frigates were able to shorten the odds. Also, Indefatigable, as I have pointed out, was far from an ordinary frigate. For 10 hours they pounded one another amid a fierce storm and throughout the dark of night. Among the mayhem of manoeuvre and counter-manoeuvre and the storm, all 3 ships were driven up against the French coast. Droit de l'Homme and HMS Amazon ran aground. But somehow, by hook or by crook, Pellew's Indefatigable once again managed to slip the noose and clawed her way back out to sea amid the storm. Pellew is without doubt regarded as the greatest frigate commander of all time. He was strict. He had his men flogged if necessary. But then he had to deal with a great many pressed men who did not want to be there. But he was well known for caring a great deal for the health of his crew. At times he would not eat all his own food, and instead share it with the sick seamen aboard ship. Several times he is known to have jumped into the sea to save drowning crewmen. But please consider, ladies and gentlemen, that the naval encounters of which I tell you here are merely the military engagements. Frigates were the sharks out there. The grand ships of the line may have had the guns and fancy dining facilities, but it was the frigates who had speed and agility on their side. And so it was the frigates who hunted down the merchant vessels of the enemy. Back in those days, the crews won prize money. They would get a share of the value of any captured ship and her cargo. The captain would get the largest share, next the officers, and so on. But so too the ordinary crewmen would share in the spoils. Pellew was the greatest, most dangerous shark of them all. He was a menace to French sea trade. By the end of his career, he had hoovered up not only the prize money for the military ships captured, but of a great deal of merchant shipping. The war with France saw him earn over 300,000 guineas in prize money, the equivalent of which would be over £60 million today, or roughly 75 million in colonial dollars. It is thus believed that some of his crewmen may indeed have been wealthy men by the time Captain Pellew was finished with them. Maybe, given the story of Captain Pellew and the many other daring do's of the Royal Navy during that era, it is necessary to explain just what had happened to set the British fleet apart from all the others. It all goes back to 1757. During the 7 Years' War, the British did the unthinkable and actually executed an admiral. What for? It was found at court-martial that he had failed to do his utmost in the fight for the island of Minorca. Admiral John Byng was killed by a firing squad on the 14th of March 1757, and it is in those words, failed to do his utmost, in which the explanation lies for what was to follow. It was not the fear of court-martial or execution which motivated the officers of the day. Far more a culture had been created in the Royal Navy, maybe inadvertently, which knew no equal in its day. The officer class were determined to do their utmost, no matter what the odds. At times their bravery seemed almost suicidal. In turn, the Royal Navy earned a reputation for fierce aggression. Attack was the best defence. Edward Pellew was the product of that culture. In 1804 he was promoted to Rear Admiral and given command of the East Indies station. So if you're wondering where he might have been at the Battle of Trafalgar, he was in faraway Penang in modern-day Malaysia. Yet again he was to set a heroic example, at one point climbing aloft barefoot on his own flagship with an axe in bad weather to hack away a damaged spar and save the ship. More so, being an admiral, now he could make his own rules. And so he insisted to be shown all ships' punishment books in the fleet once a month, so he could keep an eye on whether the men in his charge were being mistreated. This practice was eventually adopted by the entire Royal Navy. By 1810 he was back in Europe, commanding this fleet or that. Realising he had missed Trafalgar, the great sea battle to surpass all sea battles of the age, Pellew feared he had missed his chance and would become a dusty desk admiral of whom no one had ever heard. But he would have his moment. There would indeed be that great triumph. In 1816, when Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Fleet, he led an Anglo-Dutch fleet against the Barbary States. The most famous action therein was the bombardment of Algiers. Aggressive as ever, Pellew took his fleet close inshore and fought it out with the Algerian guns. The Dutch and British fired 50,000 round shot, using 118 tons of gunpowder, and the bomb ketches fired 960 mortar shells. On top of that, the Allies also had rocket ships firing Congreve missiles. The British fleet suffered considerable losses. Next day, however, the port resembled a ruin. The Dey of Algiers had to submit to British demands. The days of piracy and raids by ships from the Barbary coast were at an end. No fewer than 1,200 Christian slaves were freed in Algiers that day, making Pellew the toast of Europe. Back in Britain, they made him a Viscount. Yes, in December 1816, he was indeed the Lord Pellew, 1st Viscount Exmouth. It did not stop there. From all across Europe he was showered in titles. The midshipman who had been dropped off at Marseille had made good. Pellew died in 1833. His wishes for his burial matched the man. No singing, no sermon. Pellew had been one of the greatest of Nelson's generation. Whereas some question how great a leader he was as an admiral, there is no doubt that he was an exceptional human being. A gentleman who sent money to support the widow of Captain Moulin, who had died during the capture of the frigate Cleopatra. A man who would dive into the sea to save an ordinary seaman who had fallen overboard, who would share his food with the sick, and who would refuse to destroy a stricken enemy vessel that he knew to be full of injured men. But most of all, Edward Pellew, 1st Viscount Exmouth, went down in history as the greatest, most successful frigate captain who ever lived. Why, they even have a statue to him at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. But maybe it is best left to one of his rivals, Sir Thomas Fremantle, to sum up the man. I am known to dislike him personally very much, but when he had command of the fleet, the Admiralty could go to sleep without care. That is all from the Zava Pass for now. Thank you very much, and goodbye.